Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate the opportunity to address the House and talk about the things that we're doing here in this House to continue to fund government, to keep the government open. If you look at what's been going on these last couple of weeks, Mr. Speaker, you've seen more than 4 bills passed by the House of Representatives to fund all of government. You've seen us send bills over to the Senate to keep government open. But what you've also seen, Mr. Speaker, is the President of the United States and the leader of the Senate refusing to take up the bills because they're not getting everything they want. The Senate President, Mr. Speaker, Harry Reid, said if he's not going to budge an inch, not an inch from his position. He'd rather shut the government down than to move 1 inch. President Obama has said he won't negotiate. He refuses to negotiate with Republicans unless they give him everything he wants. He won't budge an inch. And so what we've done in the House, Mr. Speaker, during that time is say, you know what? We're going to put a lot of options on the table because we do believe we ought to fund government properly. We ought to address the problems facing our country, get our economy moving again, address all the problems that the President's health care law is facing. But we also know that we live in a democracy. And when you've got divided government, Mr. Speaker, that means both sides ultimately have to come together. It's what our laws actually demand. And yet you've got a president saying, it's my way or the highway. If I don't get everything I want, I won't budge. And then you've got Republicans saying, let's pass bills to keep things going. Let's actually negotiate and work out our differences. And I think the American people are realizing that, Mr. Speaker. They're seeing the unreasonable approach by President Obama. If you look at what's happened in the House the last few days, you're actually seeing a groundswell not just of Republican ideas to keep government funded. We passed a bill to fund the veterans. Shouldn't we all, while we got all these other disagreements on government, there are actually areas where Republicans and Democrats agree. You don't hear a lot about it, Mr. Speaker, but there are a number of those. And so we've started putting those ideas on the table and saying, you know, we have some real disagreements over health care policy, but shouldn't we at least fund our veterans? Shouldn't we at least fund cancer treatment for those patients that are struggling through cancer, that aren't looking at this from a Republican or a Democrat issue? They just want their treatment. And so we passed, it got bipartisan votes in the House. It was not a partisan vote. A lot of Democrats joined with Republicans to say, let's at least fund the cancer treatment while we're negotiating these other differences. And the Senate Majority Leader's answer, Mr. Speaker, was, why would we want to do that? How shameful, Mr. Speaker, that you would have the Senate Majority Leader saying he'd rather hold them hostage unless he gets everything he wants. Nobody gets everything they want in a democracy. And so we continue to pass bills, Mr. Speaker, to address these problems. We've passed bills to fund our National Guard troops. Again, large bipartisan votes, a growing number, by the way, of Democrat votes that have been joining with Republicans to take a reasonable approach to this. Because, again, my way or the highway is not how you govern in a democracy. And yet you go and you send those bills over to fund our veterans, to fund our National Guard, to fund cancer patients. And you literally, on a party line vote, have the Senate leader saying he's going to kill those bills until he gets everything he wants, and forcing every Democrat in the Senate to vote with him. Horrible votes that they're casting over there to play some kind of partisan game. That's not how our democracy works, Mr. Speaker. And where's the president's leadership on this? You should see the president standing up and saying, stop these games, stop punishing people, stop taking hostages. And yet he's so afraid to stare down the Senate Majority Leader that he sits on the sidelines and continues just to throw rocks at people instead of getting in the fray and saying, as all adults in a room should get together and say, let's work out our differences. The president continues to say he won't budge an inch. So today, Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue moving forward in the House. As a tropical storm enters the Gulf of Mexico, we're going to take up a bill that says we ought to fund our emergency response in FEMA. Shouldn't, again, we at least be able to put partisan differences on the side on other issues that are unrelated and say at least we agree we ought to take care and respond to disasters? And that bill will be on the floor, and I'll predict, Mr. Speaker, that you'll see a bipartisan support to vote that bill out of the House and pass it over to the Senate. And maybe, just maybe, let's all hold out encouragement that the Senate Majority Leader will finally put his partisan differences on the side and say, let's at least agree to do that. Don't hold hostages. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, when you look at what the president's been doing with these monuments, punishing American people, the World War II memorial is a great example of the greatness of America, the greatest generation, tribute to those men and women who risked everything. You had heroes in their 20s that stormed the beaches of Normandy, and they stared down the enemy. They didn't blink. And, of course, they come earlier this week to the World War II Memorial to see the memorial that was built in their honor, and they're faced with Obamacades blocking off that memorial. And I'm glad they stared it down and they didn't blink too, and they took that memorial. Mr. President, tear down those Obamacades. Let our veterans into the World War II Memorial. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr.